Welcome. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. We wish everyone well and that everyone is staying safe and healthy. My name is Kris Ferranti. I'm a partner in Sherman's Real Estate Group. I am also a member of Sherman's Family Office Group. Sherman's Family Office Group includes a team of attorneys across various practice areas that support our family office clients. So before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded and a replay will be posted on Sherman.com and on our social media channels through LinkedIn and Twitter. If anyone has any questions, please hold them until the end. All questions will be addressed during a Q&A segment and can be submitted through the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your screen. I'm very pleased to be hosting this webinar, a look ahead, state of the private real estate market post-US election. This webinar is part 2 of a multi-part series on family office real estate investing. On September 3rd, we had hosted a webinar, our first of the multi-part series on real estate investing in a pre and post-COVID world. And once again, it is with great pleasure that I reintroduce our guest speaker, DJ Van Keuren. DJ has more than 25 years of experience in the family office, real estate, finance, investment banking, and fund management space. Before co-founding Evergreen Property Partners, DJ served in many roles for a number of family offices, including the Montfort Companies, the Heyman Family Office, the Arsenal Family Office, and the Jane Family Office. He was named one of Family Capital's top 10 family office real estate professionals and one of Trusted Insight's top 30 family office real estate investors. He is also a member of the Forbes Real Estate Council, author of Real Estate Investing for Family Offices, founder of the Family Office Real Estate Institute, the Family Office Real Estate Magazine, and he's a frequent speaker at family office conferences around the world. So DJ, welcome. We're very excited to have you join us again.
Good. Well, thanks so much, Kris. It's a pleasure and honor to be here with you, and looking forward to our conversation.
Great. So according to most reports that I've reviewed that look at historic performance of real estate, returns on investment for investors in commercial real estate tend to do well under both Republican and Democratic administrations. There doesn't really seem to be a meaningful difference. But there are some stark policy differences between an outgoing Trump administration and an incoming Biden administration. So I want to first do a deep dive with you on possible effects to real estate investment trends as a result of the election and a change in administrations. So there's a lot to cover here. So I want to approach this systematically, starting at a high level, and then we can sort of hit specific policy items. So first, do you see any particular geographic submarkets being winners or losers as a result of the Biden administration? I think most large cities in the US, like New York City as an example, believe federal aid may be more likely on its way under a Biden administration. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think that, there's a couple of things. Obviously, Biden is looking to come in and has a lot of focus on, middle America. And that includes a couple different areas, obviously, on the healthcare side. But also when you start getting into affordable housing and everything else, these larger cities are definitely being hit pretty hard. And one of the main reasons is what you see in New York City, where, you couldn't sell a house necessarily in Connecticut in like January, February. And then you go along 4 or 5 months later and you're getting 9-10 offers. That's what's happening today. So you're having a tremendous amount of people that are moving out of a city. I think last number I heard was probably 16,000 retail restaurants has gone under in New York City. And I'm sure that number is larger because that was probably about a month or so ago. And so you've got a lot of, there is a lot of aid that's going to be needed in these major cities. People like legends like Sam Zell, who has a lot of office. A lot of people are moving to the urban areas because there has been a lot of migration happening outside of these major cities. Sam, however, is like, look, we're holding still. We're going to stay in the urban centers. We're going to continue to, keep our footprint there. And so there's a huge belief for it. But yeah, there's a lot of aid that's needed in these cities, but a lot, Kris, has to do with the population too, right? Because you have larger populations in these major cities. So I think that's one of the areas that he's going to really try to impact. But the reality is that there's problems throughout the whole country.
Yeah, yeah. And so do you think, if he sort of focuses on the urban centers, and as you mentioned, there are, some of those urban centers are in desperate need of some assistance at this point. Do you think that's sort of a zero-sum game? In other words, if we're projecting primary markets and urban centers to benefit, from a new administration, does that mean the other markets, secondary and tertiary markets, sort of lose out as a result of that, and maybe a pullback in terms of some of the migration trends that you noted?
I don't think so. I think that in fact, what's been happening is that those migration patterns have actually been increasing. For example, what I just mentioned about going into Connecticut, after being out of New York. I mean, when you still have all the key drivers that continue to happen in these urban areas, secondary markets, tertiary markets, where people move because of quality of life, cost of living. That's where the jobs are. Here in Denver, we're actually seeing even more people that are continuing to move to Denver. Affordability is definitely one of those areas because it is so expensive to live in a lot of these major cities. Now, with that being said, they're still major cities. There's still the New Yorks, the San Francisco's, Miami of the world. And although we're going to be seeing a decrease in these markets, I mean, New York City has been in the same situation before in the past, but it's a global destination, right? So you don't just have money coming in from the US, you've got money coming in from all over the world. And many, many people, especially foreign investors, see this as an opportunity in order to buy some great properties at a discount. So I think that these big cities will come back. I think that the incentives are going to help, but I don't necessarily think that's going to stop some of this migration that's been happening. I think that's just a natural component of, increase of taxes. I mean, look at New York. There's a lot of things that they've done and continue to do that are driving people, especially the wealthy, from New York down to Florida. And even though you've got a lot of monies that might be coming in from a Biden administration, you still have those other aspects that are still, I guess you could say, negative. So I think it's going to be par for the course, and I don't think it's going to stop the migration that's happening just because there's additional economic benefits going into these urban cores. They're actually going to need it more than these other areas because that migration will continue.
Right, right. And so, do you think there'll be any effect on the allocation that family offices allocate towards the secondary markets versus primary markets? Do you think there'll be sort of a reduction in the investments they put into the secondary markets, or do you think this ultimately won't really sway them from staying the course and investing, continuing to invest in secondary, tertiary markets at the rate they've been investing in, as we discussed during our last webinar?
Yeah, this is a question that we've done in our last 2 annual family office real estate studies. And family offices primarily invest in secondary and tertiary markets. It's a pretty staggering number, like 70-80% that actually do that. Because of this migration that continues to happen out of these major cities. And in fact, the fundamentals were fantastic going back in January. That hasn't necessarily changed. And in some ways, I think in some cities, it's actually increased about, like I was mentioned before, with these migration aspects. So families like to go there. They're smaller check sizes, which is great for for the size of the properties. they still believe in all those fundamentals and where the opportunities are. No, they're going to continue to go into the secondary markets. And as I said, I think that there's might even be more opportunity because of what's happening. The primary markets, the main investors aren't as much families as they are with institutions, right? So your endowments, your insurance companies, and foreign investors too. I mean, there's so much money that gets poured in, especially like San Francisco from Asia. And then you've got New York, international investors as a whole. So those are going to continue to be, and that's primarily because they've got to write bigger checks in order to get it out there. So these secondary markets are going to continue on once again, regardless. And I believe we're even going to see an uptick.
Got it. How about affordable housing projects? I think the Trump administration eliminated one of the Obama mandates that municipalities develop plans to combat discriminatory housing practices if they're providing federal financing. It looks like Biden's likely to bring that rule back. I think you have within the economic plan that Biden put forth $100 billion affordable housing for funding and providing tax incentives for the construction of affordable housing. And I think during the campaign you had Biden issued an economic plan to invest $650 billion in federal funds to improve public housing and provide more forms of rental assistance, including Section 8 vouchers. So with these federal subsidies, do you see maybe more investment in affordable housing projects by family office investors?
You've touched on something that's been a topic for quite some number of years right now, which is the affordable housing aspect of it. And that's been a challenge on many, many fronts. And that's only going to increase as time goes on to come up with those solutions. So a lot of these programs that you're talking about with Biden are actually needed. There's definitely a huge demand for that. But with families, it depends, because a lot of these you can get great cash flow from these property types. They are longer term holds for sure. And so it comes back down to the, what the family wants to do from an allocation wise, right? So you got a lot of families that want 5 to 7 years and they want opportunistic value add development deals within those various times. But yet you've also got a significant number of families want that long-term hold, 10, 15 years. I mean, real estate is what I believe is the best possible asset class in order to maintain and create legacy and generational wealth. And so that long-term is very, very important. I think to specifically answer your questions, believe it or not, a lot of, depending on whether the family created their money in real estate, that their wealth in real estate, that they're going to have their own specific property types that they're going to be going after. But it really comes down to an educational component for a lot of these families. So the majority of families aren't necessarily taking advantage of some of these affordable housing programs just from a mere lack of understanding or knowledge of that. So I think similar to the opportunity zone investments, which was one of the reasons why there was a lack of investment into OZs, was from an educational perspective. So I think that will families invest in those? They will, but they need to have a greater understanding about those opportunities.
Great, thank you. So next, I want to turn to workforce housing, and I want to discuss it together with the possibility of a new stimulus bill in the coming months. And this touches on a topic that you recently wrote about, and you expressed some concern, that workforce housing occupancy levels may be somewhat artificially inflated by stimulus money that working families have been using to pay rent. And I believe in your article, you projected in the next 3 to 6 months, we may see some workforce housing distressed opportunities. So you have a Biden administration which seems more inclined to try to push through new stimulus. As an example, the HEROES Act, which was passed in May, by a Democrat controlled House included $100 billion in emergency rental assistance. So do you think this sort of stimulus could pass now? And if it does, or something like it passes during a Biden administration, will it have any impact on your workforce housing distress projections? You know, will it push
Yeah,
the 3 to 6 months out, or maybe eliminate that entirely?
yeah, I do think it's going to happen because there's definitely a huge demand. You see a lot of states right now that are starting to extend the some of the restrictions, right? So that you can't go out for a period of time. And I would not be surprised if when Biden comes in and says, okay, everybody is mandated to stay at home for three weeks or what, 4 weeks, whatever the case is. And, you know, retail has been getting hammered. Restaurants have been getting hammered. I gave an example of New York where 16,000 restaurants went under. And then you look at that on a whole basis, and you know, retail employees is a big portion of workforce housing. And so if they're not working, they don't have the money to pay the rent. If they're, you know, if COVID finished tomorrow, they don't have basically necessarily jobs to go back to, which is an income issue. So they pass another stimulus bill. And once again, it's going to artificially inflate what's been happening because they've got money in order to make payments. And the number one thing that families want to do is to keep a roof over their head, right? And so that's where they're going to take that stimulus money and, you know, make those payments. Now, you talk a lot of owners from multifamilies properties, and they're like, hey, we've been at 97, 96%. Well, if you look at some of the recent statistics that's been coming out, a lot of this vacancy has started picking up to about 8%. Now, historically, the lowest we've ever gone was little over 11% from a vacancy perspective, and this was during the recession. So with this money that's coming in, by all means, it's been artificially providing some of these stats. Usually there's a 6 to 9 month delay on multifamily results of what's actually happening with them compared to other property types. And that's because it takes time to go through the eviction process, right? So I didn't make a payment. Oh, you're due. Then you do the next month. Oh, I didn't make a payment. You got to catch up. Well, maybe in the third month, you catch up for month one. When they start the eviction process, there's a period of time that it takes. That's why it's 6 to 9 months lag. So because of that, it is going to create opportunities. But with a stimulus bill, if they come out, which I do think they will, then it is going to push it back another, 3 to 6 months, whatever that period of time is. But it's inevitable. I mean, because of the type of workers that live in these locations.
Got it. Thank you. So we have some state legislators in New York calling on Biden to provide relief for New Yorkers in the form of canceling rent. And I think Biden has called for rent forgiveness, but has not released any specific details on that and what it would look like. Do you see any possibility of that form of relief making its way through Congress and onto Biden's desk, or through executive action? I assume the real estate community would not be as receptive to the form of relief that cancels rent without similar relief for owners and lenders of those real estate apartment projects.
Well, that's the thing is, I mean, what doesn't make any sense to me for that is that even if you're not a real estate you can see the great rent. Well, how are the owners going to get the income, which in turn is paying the cost of all the expenses in order to run that property, and of course your loans. So now you start saying, okay, well, you don't have to make a payment, renter, and you don't have to have you don't have to make payments to the lender. What's the lender going to do? The lender is also utilizing that money as income in order to run their business. So I don't think that I don't know how it can work. I mean, when this started, the government agencies, the Fannie and Freddies and whatnot, they had about 30,000 people that they or lenders, I'm sorry, owners that had loans that they put on a moratorium, so they didn't have to pay for a period of time. Now that could happen. That could possibly happen for a period of time, and then they tag it on to the back of the loan. So that's possibly it. If they did do something like this, Kris, they'd have to do it for a short time. They couldn't have it continual for, it'd have to be an alternative to maybe some of the stimulus money. But I don't know how they could carry it or have everybody on board for more than 3 to 6 months.
Yeah.
I think the impact, they're going to find that, and the people that are rallying against that happening, I think it's going to be tough. It's a possibility. But with the vaccine coming out too, that might limit some of these concerns.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think rent cancellation doesn't take into account sort of the domino effect it would have on all the parties in the capital stack of any real estate project, as you said. And so, canceling rent for the tenants does no good for those people who own the project, the lenders, and all the investors included within the capital stack of any real estate project. So next, how about infrastructure projects? I know in New York we have the Gateway program, which is a major revamp of the northeast rail corridor, including the Hudson River Tunnel. And then you have another example being the projects underway by the MTA, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which operates the subway system in New York City and the Long Island Railroad. And the MTA is in desperate need of a cash injection. I think on the campaign trail, you had Biden speaking of efforts to fund clean energy and other infrastructure investments, which could mean trillions of dollars spent towards these infrastructure projects. How would these projects impact real estate investment trends in the geographic markets?
Well, you've got, when you look at infrastructure, I mean, these projects are so large, like you were saying, I mean, they're significant. Yeah. So the investors that invest into these are the larger institutions, the sovereign wealth funds. I mean, the pockets that have a tremendous amount of money. Now, when you look back at, when we started building our whole road system, it was really done after the war, and it was to get people back to work. It was to people to generate jobs, and that's one thing that working on some of these infrastructure projects will do. It'll get people back to working again, right? Which is extremely important. And we have a lot of infrastructure issues outside of improvements like what you're talking about and with Metro and everything, but there's a lot of bridges, there's a lot of roads that need help. And no president that I know of have really taken a stance on that. They've talked about it a lot, but this might be the time that it might actually happen because of that need to get people back working, especially when a lot of these jobs, like we were talking about before, already have gone away. So I think I think that if they push forward on that, I think it's extremely positive. I think that like I said, the larger investors are the ones that are going to really benefit from that. And then you've got the Skanskas of the world that's going to oversee that and develop it and as well. But it could solve a couple different issues, right? So it could be once again, putting people back to work, jobs and helping the country as a whole.
Yeah, right. Exactly. All right. So next, I want to cover how investment may be impacted by a new pandemic response by a new administration. We covered in depth during the webinar in September how the pandemic, has impacted family office real estate investment. And a lot has since happened. We're entering the winter now. Cases are beginning to rise. New York City schools just recently closed. And you have some local lockdowns or lockdown-like restrictions being implemented throughout the country. And at the same time, we have some promising news with the development of a vaccine, although it'll take some time before that's able to be widely disseminated. The Trump administration, for the most part, other than September 4th nationwide eviction moratorium that was enacted by the CDC has sort of deferred to states and local counties to address local restrictions and eviction, foreclosure, rental moratoriums. How do you think a new administration would approach it?
For the moratoriums and the closings of various properties.
That's right. Yeah. So any, eviction moratoriums, foreclosure moratoriums, rental moratoriums, potential lockdowns, how would that potentially impact the markets, the real estate market?
I think it goes back to what we were talking about before, which is you're going to have, if there's additional lockdowns, there's definitely going to be impacts on a lot of these retail locations, the gyms. I mean, you've had the number of businesses that are filed Chapter 11 is significant, and it's a lot of major brands that we've heard about our whole lifetime, and so there's been a tremendous impact. I think that it goes back to, hopefully the government taking a stance in Biden's administration to really looking at what's this total impact. Is it a short-term impact that creates long-term issues, or is it something that, it can be just used sort of as a Band-Aid per se? So I think it comes back to, they're estimating that the Senate's going to be Republican. With that, there's going to be things that don't get through that might have been if the Senate was Democratic. I mean, we've obviously got to wait until January to find out, but it looks like that's probably going to be the case. So I think, that's going to have a big impact for us, Chris, is if the Senate stays Republican, because then there's going to be a lot less opportunities for Democrats to get things through.
So that leads me to the next topic I want to hit, which is on 1031 exchanges. So in July, the Biden campaign announced that they drastically limit 1031 exchanges. And I think this is in an effort to collect more taxes to pay for a $775 billion plan for child and senior care for 10 years. And he'd like to limit like-kind or 1031 exchanges, which for those participating who are not as familiar with it, it allows investors selling a property to defer capital gains taxes if they put those funds into another property. And how he wants to drastically limit it is by making it only available to those making less than $400,000 per year. I think of all the Biden's real estate related proposals, this perhaps has seen the most pushback from the industry. How likely is it now, and you mentioned with the Senate, I mean, how likely is it now that he could even accomplish this? And if he did, let's assume Democrats are able to take control of the Senate. How devastating would this be for the real estate market and family office real estate investing?
Well, that's a good question. That's probably the biggest issue that is on the docket from a real estate perspective. That's definitely one at the top of the list. It's a policy that's been around for over 100 years. They've tried to eliminate 1031 exchanges for a number of times over the years, and they have not been able to do that, with the exception that they did keep the real estate 1031 exchange in place, but they got rid of other things like being able to do a 1031 exchange on jets or on storage or oil and gas, right? So they did succeed in one effort. But the industry, is one that has a lot of people that are trying to explain to these guys, and it's really educating them that you really shouldn't do that. And there's a couple of reasons for it. There's a report that was done back in 2011, and they estimated that the actual tax saving or taxes that they would get to go toward that $740+ billion was anywhere from 200 to 3 billion. Now that's 2011. So let's say we kick it up to 4 billion. That's still not a significant amount toward that 740 billion that they're looking for. And the other thing too is that what's your downside on this thing? Well, what would happen is if they got rid of the 1031 exchanges is, first off, people are going to start holding longer. So they're not going to be as active in the real estate market. They're going to get larger loans. They're going to, and because of that, and you don't have as much activity, that means you're cutting down on the construction, which then goes into the cost of labor and everything, and also for the lumber, right? Everything that goes along the line. Attorneys are going to have less to do on the real estate side because there's not as many transactions. And then you start getting into the brokers and you know, it just keeps going down the road. So the impact that you're going to have on these people, which now won't have the money to put into the economy, is pretty significant. Now, the other thing too that they need to understand is that now about 70% of families don't use 1031 exchanges, which is pretty staggering. However, when they do 1031 exchanges, they're much larger properties, right? So you're looking, you could have $100 million 1031 exchange. You could have easily a $30 million 1031 exchange, et cetera. And 80% of all 1031 exchanges, when money is put into another property to defer these taxes, are actually sold after the first 1031 exchanges. So if you look at that, you're actually having a bigger pie for taxes to come from because of 1031 exchanges, right? So and family offices and wealthy individuals are the ones that's going to have that type of gains that get paid. So it just doesn't make economically a lot of sense in order to get rid of that. Now, if it stays at 400,000 or less, that's still a significant number of 1031 exchanges. Because of the minimal number of families that do 1031 exchanges, you get a lot more from the real estate companies that are doing these, the large, the developers or whatever the case is, which is another statistic. But from a family perspective, they're not doing a ton of them, but when they do, they're significant in size. So why would you get rid of those people? Because the impact isn't as big as I think what you think it is, and you're not going to be hindering 1031s as a whole, just to a small amount of people. And so that amount that's going to go toward that 740 billion is going to be pretty insignificant.
Great. Yeah, I agree. I think the elimination of 1031 exchanges would not generate more revenue for the government as intended. And I think what might happen is once they start analyzing it and looking at the data that you pointed out, they'll understand how much 1031s actually provide for the economy, and they might move the repeal of 1031s down the priority list because they create all that deal flow, which ultimately creates jobs and more revenue.
That's right. And my understanding from people that's been up on the Hill in the past, in years past, is that it's simply, there'd be people going into senators' offices and everything explaining this.
Right.
And the feedback I heard was that they just didn't understand what those
Right.
stats were. And they're like, well, this doesn't, because once you have that information, it's sort of a no-brainer. And especially if Republicans maintain the Senate, then I think that's even a less chance that it's going to happen. I have talked to some people that has somebody full-time that's constantly up on the Hill talking about these 1031 exchanges, and it doesn't seem like they're really going to be affected at all.
Got it. Great. So next, I want to touch on opportunity zones, which you briefly mentioned earlier. So Biden also plans to reform opportunity zones or OZs. And for those participants not familiar with it, it was a program that stems from the tax overhaul in 2017, and it aims to increase investment in economically distressed areas around the country. And it does so by allowing investors who sell assets to delay or defer taxes for years, so long as they put those proceeds into one of these opportunity zone investments. But some groups have criticized OZs for failing to achieve their intended purpose and benefiting developers more than some of those designated communities. At least that's been some of the criticism. Biden has said he would reform the OZ program. It's unclear exactly how he would do that. I think according to his website, the reforms would include more reporting, investors providing detailed reporting, public disclosure on their opportunity zone investments, and the impact on those local residents. And I think the reforms would also include the Treasury Department being more involved in closely parsing which areas are declared opportunity zones. How do you think these types of reforms could impact family office real estate investments in OZs?
Well, I think there's two aspects here. One is I think from the family office perspective, and I also think from, just from a investment perspective into the country as a whole, which is one of the reasons why they created this. This is something that's definitely needed to look at. I mean, you had, I think, 8,500 locations, I believe it is, that were declared opportunity zones initially. I think one was down in Hudson Yards, which was already going through a bunch of, redevelopment already. There was already a lot of gentrification happening. There's numerous markets also over in Las Vegas in the old side of the Strip. And in fact, the founder of Zappos had already been going through part of that gentrification, right? So what's the real impact that's happening in these areas? And that's been a question and an issue from day one. Now, I do know of a few families actually that are doing that. Jim Sorensen is one of them. He's a global social impact leader, and he's actually came up with a scorecard which would identify what are the benefits that are going to be into these areas. And then he also has an incentive with the local operators that he works with to say, if you don't hit these certain milestones that actually creates a social impact, you're not going to get, your returns, your investment of what you're going to make is going to be based upon you achieving these objectives, which is huge. Warren Buffett's son came up with actually a software with an algorithm to identify what those benefits are. And this is a huge problem back in Washington. In fact, Anthony Scaramucci was talking one day. He was working on a opportunity zone investment down in Florida, and he had talked about, well, you can identify what jobs are created and everything else. And I'm like, well, the problem that you have with that is that unless you build a hotel, you're probably not going to really create a tremendous amount of jobs. So you got to make sure that you've got specific criteria that's going to identify that. And I think that's important because of all these areas, it has to be a delicate balance for helping that area, for the developer, right, to make money, and investors to make money. Now, right now, with all family offices, the first thing that they're doing is specifically saying, what's my return? Right? What type of return am I getting? And what's my cost of capital analysis? Because there's many families that'll say, well, geez, if I can get a high rate of return, because the average is probably before taxes, 10 to 11%. If you looked at all the different projects that they're going to get now with the tax benefit, that they're up to 14 to 15. But a lot of these development projects, today you should be getting high teens, low 20s. A couple of years back, it was 25 to 30%. So what's the true benefit that's creating from the investment per side? What am I going to get? So that's been the driving aspect of all these opportunity zones for family offices. And the impact was secondarily. Now, that goes back to what is happening in the family office market as a whole, which is the first gen, the patriarchs, you go to them and they say, hey, you can get an 18% return. And secondarily, you're going to create a social impact, right? Or you can create a social impact and get a 14% return. Well, every time they're going with the 18% return, it's the younger generations that are actually more focused on the ESGs and the social impact. And in fact, by 2030, millennials are going to end up with about $68 trillion worth of monies that are going to be transferred to their generation. And so that's when you're going to really see an interest in really making these impact. But this needs to be done. Unfortunately, it went off old census numbers. And I think it's great if they really try to quantify what the impact's going to be. And then it goes back to your question before about affordable housing. Well, these are areas that you can do affordable housing, that it's going to come into play. And so I think hopefully it'll all come together, but it's something that's definitely needed. And hopefully families start taking into consideration what's the true social impact. I will tell you myself is that if you read some of the articles that I wrote in the past, I was like, look, make sure that the tail is not wagging the dog. And, so it's not tax driven. And I never really looked at the social impact till I really had a chance to sit down with Jim Sorensen to really understand this social impact component, which is huge. And unfortunately, majority of families don't take that in consideration when investing into these areas.
Great. So I want to discuss just distress opportunities next. I think we covered much of this during the September webinar, where you took us through each of the different sectors. And I don't think much of that analysis has changed all that much, but I want to focus on the hotel sector. And hotels, as you know, have been among the hardest hit asset classes as the pandemic brought, business conferences, tourism, travel to a virtual halt. And according to reports, the national occupancy rate bottomed out at about 25% in April, and had many of the emptiest hotels not closed entirely, which would have removed those vacant rooms from the calculation, the rate would have been even much lower. But the U.S. Hotel industry saw an uptick in early May when travelers went to resort towns in states like Florida and Texas, which were beginning to lift restrictions. And that bounce back, from what I've heard, has given some hope, in that sector, in that the sector will quickly recover when more states do begin to reopen and there's a vaccine that's widely disseminated. So the fact that there were people instantly willing to, head out for that leisure activity and stay in hotels was seen as a major positive sign for the hotel industry. And so there seems to be a lot of discussion around finding distressed opportunities about assets in the hotel sector primarily. What are your thoughts on hotels?
Yeah, well, I can definitely. So we at Evergreen, we've been working with the Marriott family on some of the distress that's been going on and the opportunities in the market. And it's, the bottom line is that we're seeing a lot of downturns happening. Definitely depends on the property type too. So the properties that, or the hotels that took the ones, right, the Four Seasons of the world, and that's because they had additional costs that they had to take care of. They have the concierge, they've got the restaurants, and a lot of them were really dependent on the conferences that they'd have. And that obviously just the area that maintained pretty well has been the select service. So you're looking at the Courtyard by, the Sheratons, the Fairfields, and those are areas that they didn't have to have the extra cost of having the restaurants and everything else. But we were definitely seeing 20 to 30% discounts. There's a property we're looking at in Northern California that was, appraised back in February for about 105 million, where we were looking at, they were taking offers at around 77 million. And so there was definitely that disconnect. You also had a lot of operators that were actually owning, let's say, 10 different flag or 10 hotels under a single flag, for example. And they literally would go out to the market to say, look, take any two that you want. I'm not going to tell you which two to take. You decide which two that you want to take, and we'll sell them to you, because they wanted to keep the other 10. There's been a little pullback based upon the discount that you can get. So yes, it has improved a little bit, but that has been the primary area where there's been opportunities on the hospitality sector. I got a call the other day for, oh geez, a bunch of hotels in New York, 2 different times that were, hey, we got 6 or 7 of them we want to sell. Well, that just keeps going down. I heard too that the Mandarin Oriental up on Columbus Circle is actually on the blocks for 450, 500, maybe 550 million or so. So there might have been a little difference. I think that with the coronavirus vaccine, we definitely have seen a little bit of pullback on some of the concerns, but there's still a ton of opportunity on the hospitality sector. And, depending on the markets that you're looking in, and that's going to continue to be the case. And we'll continue to see some fallout over the next probably five months or so, because you can't even get debt on properties right now for hotels. It's extremely difficult to get loans on hotels. And so you still got to go off the factor that, some of them are operating at 50% of occupancy.
Great, thank you. So we're heading into the Q&A segment here, we've been getting some questions which I've been sort of weaving through in the discussion we've been having. So I think we've hit quite a bit of them already in terms of trends and other drivers behind the new administration and COVID. One question that we have not covered, you briefly touched on it earlier, but maybe you can expand on it a little bit. How do you see foreign investment in U.S. real estate being impacted? I mean, we saw in 2017 that the tax reform was seen as a net positive, but under the Trump administration, we've had some increased scrutiny through CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S., and government oversight of foreign investment, including specifically, changes to CFIUS relating to real estate. And then we also saw some increased limitations on the EB-5 immigration program, which has been used in recent years as a capital source for many real estate projects. And then you've also had some trade spats with some countries. How do you see foreign investment being impacted in the coming years?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. When you look at the EB-5 program, for those that don't realize, is that you can make an investment of anywhere between $500,000 to, let's say, $1 million. And what it does is you invest into a project and you're able to get a green card. So it was a way for a lot of very wealthy families around the world in order to get, a green card into the U.S. And a lot of times they do that for their family, their kids, etc. So I think one of the reasons for a pullback on that is Trump was really trying to close the borders, trying to have less people come into the U.S. That was one of the tactics that he took, which was why there was some restrictions that were put on EB-5. With Biden, I see he's going to loosen that back up because he's not as focused, I guess you could say, on some of those issues, and having other people from other countries come back in the States. There's been there's some other restrictions too, quite honestly, with certain countries around the world, Vietnam being one, where it'd be difficult to send somebody over for secondary education, right? So I think some of those areas are going to free up. Investors from around the world, every family, all the families that I've spoken to, a lot of families are continuing to put U.S. on the top of the table for where they want to invest into. And that's going to continue to be relevant. And I also think that in these major cities, like we initially talked about, the New Yorks and San Francisco, that investment is going to continue to come in. Probably we'll start seeing additional increases of capital because of the purchasing opportunities that are available. I mean, people have joked before that San Francisco is owned by the Chinese. A lot of it is in these major buildings, and which is true. And in these big cities where there's opportunities, I think we're going to see additional foreign investment that's coming in. And I think we'll also see some of the restrictions being lifted in an effort to increase our relationships with other countries through a Biden administration.
Great. So one other question has come in, DJ, relating to shared spaces. So platforms like WeWork or Regus. And I guess this also goes to a broader question about the office sector in general. And I guess, maybe if you can expand on that in terms of how families would look at an office opportunity that has some percentage of the occupancy with one of these shared space tenants.
That's a good question. I mean, one of the things I could never understand when SoftBank was looking at putting a significant amount of money in the WeWorks, I didn't understand that. This was pre-pandemic because it's all based upon operations. They didn't own any of the hard assets. Personally, I think that they went about it wrong. They tried to grow too fast rather than saying, let's own the building and then let's lease the rest out. And we know that we're one of the main tenants per se on it. But with share, WeWorks is seeing a significant issue right now. I think a lot of this shared office space too, if you go into any of them, there's a lot of open spaces. There's a lot of, areas that people will sit next to each other, computers, like at a Starbucks and everything else. And I think that offices are going to be going the opposite way. I think we're going to go back to the traditional offices that have doors. Because you're going to have that confinement ability and you don't have, so many people talking and all the exposure. So I think that it's going to go back. It's going to start moving back to that, which could very well mean that you need more space because you're going to have additional walls and everything else. I think that for quite some time that this shared space is going to be hit. I think until people get to the point where they really feel they're back to normalcy, they're not going to want to be in those areas. And so it's going to be hard for WeWorks to continue on. On the office sector perspective, there's a lot of companies that are starting to want their people to go back to work. In fact, the CEO of Marriott said, everybody needs to come back to work. Everybody needs to start traveling again. And that's what's going to happen going into the next year. I think I told you I was listening to Sam Zoe one day, and for those that remember how the internet sort of got started for us all with modems, he had said one time that, and this was about 2 months ago, he's like, I don't know anybody that can effectively manage by modem, which I thought was pretty interesting. You do need that interaction. People are starting to realize that they need the interaction. Offices are going to come back, and especially out on the urban side, a lot of people have been moving out to the outskirts, just like you said, Kris. And so there's definitely office, and there's usually more space in those areas. But Sam Zell is not leaving, like I said before, his footprint on any of these urban locations, which I think coming from him is a significant. He's been right almost every single time. And so if he's taking a stand and saying, we're going to keep our offices and we're going to keep moving forward, I think that's something to be said about where the office sector should end back up. Great.
Thank you, DJ. One other question that has come up on another one of tax policies of the Biden administration has been a potential rollback of the rule that would let heirs wipe out, tax liability on capital gains by resetting the value of the property they inherit. The stepped up basis of real estate they inherit. How do you see that playing out and the impact on especially family office investors?
That's a big one. I think that's a very big one. I think that that comes into a tax planning perspective of what would have to be done, because if you're going to do that, there's some considerable gains that are put in place that you'd be taxed on. I think from a family office perspective, that is definitely not a positive. And I think it's going to create a lot of planning that's going to need to be done. Now, one of the things I will tell you is that I know of a couple family offices couple of multifamily offices. One was a multifamily office doing a significant amount of anticipation that what was going to happen in the election, right? And if gains were going to go up and everything else. And so they were trying to anticipate what was going to happen, and they were worried about all this taxes that changes that were going to be proposed by the Biden administration. But then there was another single family that I was talking to, pretty sizable, and they're like, "What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" Well, once they realized that Biden was going to be coming into office, they felt that the Senate was going to stay majority Republican, they shifted. So rather than going into an opportunity zone, they actually said, you know what, we're going to start putting money into all this stuff that because we don't feel that the taxes are going to be changed. A lot of these tax implications. So if it does happen, I think it could have a significant impact, especially when we go back to $68 trillion passing to the millennials by 2030. That's an awful lot of money. So I would imagine the Biden administration will be looking at that and saying, hey, this might be a place to tap into, although they only get a portion of that over that period of time. But it'll definitely go back to families having to do additional planning, look at what they have in place, trying to defer some of these taxes. And I don't think it's going to happen, but it'd be significant.
Thank you, DJ. Yeah, I agree. I think the stepped up basis for heirs who inherit from families, together with the 1031 exemption, has really played a huge role in the multi-generational wealth. And one of the reasons family offices have allocated significant amount to real estate, so it would have certainly a negative impact going forward if that were to be repealed. All right, great. That's all the questions we have, and I think we're at the end of the hour. So I want to thank everyone for joining, and I also want to thank guest speaker DJ Van Keuren for his invaluable insights. And it's been really a pleasure, DJ, speaking with you once again. So thank you again.
No, Kris, I appreciate that, and when you'd asked me to do this, I mean, your firm and yourself just does a tremendously great opportunity. And so I feel that being able to give back to you guys a little bit like this is something that I would do it immediately. So I appreciate you and your firm and the great work you guys do.
Great. Thank you, DJ. Take care, everyone.